Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar. I am Daita Sergi, Education Programs Manager with AASHE, and I'll be the moderator today. It is my pleasure to welcome you all. As many of you know, AASHE's mission is to inspire and catalyze higher education to lead the global sustainability transformation. We are an international association with about 1,000 members spread across more than 20 countries, including Greece and Oman. We serve as the professional home for campus sustainability staff, but we offer resources for everyone in higher education. We provide an expansive collection of online resources, networking tools, and educational events, such as today's webinar and an annual conference and expo, which was held this year, October 15 to 18 in San Antonio, Texas. You can learn more about AASHE on our website, www.aashe.org. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Everyone in the audience is on mute, but please feel free to ask questions or provide comments at any point during the presentation. You can do that by typing your questions or comments in the questions pane in the control panel on your screen. You can also email us if you have additional questions at education@aashe.org. At the end of the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to provide feedback regarding today's presentation. We take your suggestions into account when planning for future webinars, so please do provide this feedback. Please note this webinar is being recorded. If you experience technical difficulties or have to leave early, you and others can view the recording later. The recording and presentation materials will all be available in the Campus Sustainability Hub after the live broadcast. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Sam Hummel, CEO of Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, Robert Stumberg, Professor of Law and Director of the Harrison Institute for Public Law at Georgetown University Law Center, and Diana Sheedy, founder of the Intercollegiate Coalition Against Modern Slavery. As CEO, Sam leads SPLC's strategy, program delivery, partnerships, and fundraising. He provides members with executive support for implementing strategic sustainable purchasing programs that drive innovative business practices throughout supply chains. Bob has 4 years of experience in human rights, procurement, international trade and investment, climate adaptation, community food systems, economic development, and housing policy. And Diana is a senior at Harvard College and the founder of the ICAMS Network, an intercollegiate collaboration to professionally develop student leaders to tackle modern-day slavery and exploitation and to inspire collaboration across sectors, industries, and generations. In the interest of time, I will not go over their full bios, but you can find more about the presenters on the AASHE website under this webinar listing. So finally, it is my pleasure to welcome all attendees and thank you for joining us today. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to Sam to get us started.
Great, thank you, Daita. So I let Daita know I'm going to leave my slides in this view here so that I can skip around a little bit, because I really wanted to do this webinar to have an opportunity to share back with this community that has meant a lot to me over the years, the higher education community, and just share something that I see from my vantage as the CEO of the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, an emerging trend that is happening in the landscape that I think opens up a tremendous opportunity for those of you in higher education to play a role in really expanding and improving, the quality of information that we have about what's happening in our global supply chains, and thereby also open the opportunity to improve the circumstances and the conditions under which the products and services that we're using are being produced, developed, and disposed. And just as a quick bit of background, the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council was created in 2013. It was started by 36 member organizations, including a number of higher education institutions. And it was intentionally multi-sector and multi-stakeholder from day one. And the purpose of coming together in that way was to recognize that at the end of the day, we are all buying from the same global supply chains. And many of the impacts and concerns that we're most concerned about are deep within those supply chains, sometimes 2-3 tiers down in the supply chain. And that we are going to be more effective in addressing those in a comprehensive and rigorous way if we work together to send coordinated signals, because even as one of our members, the General Services Administration of the United States government, which is arguably the largest purchasing organization in the world, they're a small portion of a global multinational company's sales. So we really have to work together across sectors and regions to reach out into these supply chains in a meaningful and influential way. And I'm pleased to say that a few years later, the Council has grown to over 180 member organizations, and the purchaser members of the Council have over $300 billion in purchasing power. And that includes 25 Fortune 500 companies, federal agencies, states, local governments, and I think almost 25 higher education institutions now. So a number of all the University of California universities, as well as many others here, some of our founders such as Arizona State University, Michigan State University, Portland Community College, and Emory University, and American University. And the reason I mention this is that it's from working with folks who are advocating for sustainable supply chains across these different sectors and regions and across these different types of organizations that I'm really seeing a shift. And it's a technological shift, it's a process shift, it's a business relations shift, it's a trade policy shift, but altogether it's adding up to the opportunity for much greater transparency into global supply chains. If we use it that way, and that's kind of the crux of the conversation. So I wanted to share with you some of my reflections on that, and then I invited Bob to come, because Bob has done some of the best thinking that I've seen on how tactically, specifically, organizations can leverage their procurement policy and practice to incorporate transparency and disclosure into that procurement, and then also incorporate it into things like due diligence and auditing and monitoring in ways that really result in situations being remedied on the ground. And so let me just back up quickly and say, why do we care about transparency and disclosure? And the reason in my mind is that it is really what drew me into doing sustainable purchasing work in the first place. When I got to Duke University as a freshman in 1999, there was a group called Duke Students Against Sweatshops that was actively campaigning the university with an incredibly compelling, very simple moral message. And that message was, hey, we should have a way to know that the products we buy and use are produced in good working conditions. It's simple. It's that simple. And that really very simple moral call led those students to be engaged in conversations with their university administration, with lawyers, licensing officials, trade policy representatives, and ultimately multinational companies like Nike and Reebok and Champion and others, and ultimately even all the way out. I ended up going and working for a while in Thailand with a group called Thai Labor Campaign, where there were other students from Students Against Sweatshops who were out there working as well. And it was all from this very simple moral obligation, really, to truly know, to truly care enough to ask, do I know that the goods and services that make my life wonderful are not coming at the expense of the wonder in someone else's life, in someone else's ecosystem, in someone else's community? And that was a profound experience for me, participating in that campaign, because of a number of things, one being that it was incredibly successful. The university and a number of other universities at the time were successful in convincing some of the largest companies in the apparel sector to disclose the locations and the factory names of the places where our licensed apparel was being produced, which then, because of that disclosure, we were able to enter into conversations about how do we now use that information to ensure the things that we cared about? And we ended up creating an organization called the Workers' Rights Consortium, which monitors those factories on behalf of the universities that are licensing their logos to the apparel manufacturers. And I'm really pleased to say, it was incredible actually. When I was working with the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, I was invited to the State Department for a meeting about impacts in global supply chains, and got goosebumps when I realized that they were presenting the work of Students Against Sweatshops and the Workers' Rights Consortium as a model for all these multinational companies and government agencies to follow. And this was 13, 14 years later. And I think it's safe to say that that is a model that we should follow, and not only because of the success in the licensed apparel supply chain, but because companies like Nike now have realized that they don't want their competitive advantage to be that they are competing in a race to the bottom for the cheapest labor, and so they have gone and disclosed their entire supply chain now, and other companies are following suit and opening up many more opportunities for advocates like you and others to engage in a conversation about, okay, are these the working conditions that we care about, that we care for? Conversations about things like living wages and other things. So I just cannot emphasize enough for any of you that are considering engaging in leveraging the procurement of your organization, your university, to press for transparency and to press for answers, that you should not be afraid, that you need to know anything more than the simple moral question. We should know. We should be able to know. I kid you not that that simple question was so powerful that I saw lawyers just come to a full stop in meetings where they thought they knew, what the answers were and why we couldn't accomplish what we were set out to do as students. And they realized that they were right. We had a right to know, and that it was a moral obligation to find out. So I went from that experience to working with Duke University on its environmentally preferable purchasing program, or on its sustainability more broadly when I graduated from school. And I was still, really enamored from that experience with the power of institutional purchasing and contracts to produce benefits for our world by changing and sending transformative signals through our global supply chains. And we developed an environmentally preferable purchasing policy and started implementing that. And one thing that I realized only really later was that approach took as its focus, finished goods and services, as in just the purchase of the finished good. What is it? What was it? Versus the supply chain. What are the conditions in that supply chain? It really only looked at the first tier. It really only asked about the environmental impacts. And as far as disclosure, it was really only focused on ingredient disclosure, which are all valuable things. And I can see in hindsight that, it would have been overwhelming and much too much work, to have sought the type of transparency that I just described in the apparel supply chain from these categories where we have so many suppliers and so many different types of products. But there were things that we were buying that were the exact same and were coming from the exact same supply chains, and that being workwear. So your employee uniforms. Those are being bought from the same global supply chains, yet we were not applying the same approach to those types of procurements. And there's profound opportunity to do that. And I'm really pleased to say and pleased to see that there are universities that are starting to recognize that their direct procurement is an opportunity to apply the same moral question and the same lens to ask and to expect answers. And so this is an example of a report that was just produced this past spring by the University of Michigan, looking at their responsible procurement and laying out a roadmap for the way that the university could proceed in several high priority categories, such as food and electronics, in seeking answers to these questions, beginning with that very simple moral question and asking for transparency and then proceeding from there. So that is a trend that I'm seeing, which I'm really excited about, and I hope that all of you will participate in or consider participating in, because it is there's another trend that it is converging with, which is that in the business community, I'm seeing an increasing level of investment in tracking supply chains. And so large organizations, whether they are government or corporate, are increasingly investing in mapping their supply chains, in building databases that collect data on their supply chain, many tiers down into their supply chain, and are doing due diligence and risk assessments, that go further out into the supply chain. And that is coming together with another stream, which is the Internet of Things, the technology stream, where people are putting RFI identifiers on packages or products as they go through the supply chain, and literally tracking things all the way from raw material through to end product with barcodes or RFID codes, and producing really granular data about the flow of goods through the system. And that is coming together with yet another technology, which is called blockchain. And blockchain is a technology that you do not need to understand. You just need to understand that what it does is it enables an accounting to accrue with a product, or even with the components of a product as it moves through the supply chain, such that the end consumer can see for sure all of the ways that that product was touched and transformed along the way, including things like the way the Fair Food Program is using it to ensure and deliver to the end customer proof that fair payment was paid for agricultural products. And these technologies are also just being combined with plain old elbow grease and data systems and technology and websites that that you're familiar with, to provide incredibly profound things. Like, this is a company called TS Designs that's in North Carolina that supplies some colleges with their apparel, including UMass, and you can take any one of their t-shirts and you can look at the threads in the t-shirt and the colors of the threads, and go to this website and pull up a tracking that shows you the exact supply chain that your t-shirt, your specific t-shirt, went through, including all of the producers, their phone numbers, their locations, information about them, and so on. It's an incredible amount of transparency. And so this is something that I think is really exciting, because this convergence of data, the convergence of the ability and the wherewithal to track it, opens the door for us to ask for that data to be provided to us as the buyers. And in large organizations that have tremendous contractual authority, the opportunity to make that type of demand is real. And whether that demand can be met today, or whether it will take a year or two for that demand to be met, is obviously a question. But there's no question that it is radically easier, or radically more likely, or more possible to bring that data forward than it was in the 1990s, when we were demanding it for the first time in the Students Against Sweatshops movement. So all I wanted to do is just share with you these threads that I think are opening up an opportunity for faculty, for students, and for procurement professionals to really expand what we think is possible in terms of being able to answer those moral questions. And now I want to wrap it up by turning it over to Bob Stumberg, who, as I said earlier, has done tremendous thinking on how you can, when you've decided that is something that you want to pursue, how you can actually do that within the process of procurement. Thank you. Turn it over to you, Bob.
This is Bob. Interesting, Sam. Just as you were introducing me, the fire alarm at Georgetown Law School went off, and there's a loudspeaker blaring right next to me telling me I should leave the building. So if you could hold the fort, Sam, I'm going to move to another location and see if I can pick up in about, I would say, 2 minutes.
Sure. And maybe there's a question that's come in, or maybe someone has a question.
Yes, we do have a question. So I'll ask this question and actually mute Bob.
Thank you.
So one of our attendees said that she loves where this presentation was going. In working together across sectors to gain more transparency in supply chains, what communication channels or software is used to create that connection?
Sure. So that's a great question, and the answer is that there isn't a single one. There are different mechanisms that are being created for different supply chains. So, for example, if you're concerned about conflict minerals, there's a conflict-free smelters initiative that has created a tracking system for conflict minerals or minerals that are sourced from or can be commingled with conflict minerals. If you're interested in, say, fair food, there's the Fair Food Program that's providing an impressive degree of transparency and so on. And so if you wanted to get started in this area, I would recommend, in the electronics industry, there's the Electronics Industry Citizenship Council that is tracking quite a bit of data on its suppliers and supply chains. And the great thing about these supply chain driven initiatives, many of which are driven by the industries themselves, is that the fact that they are collecting this data means that you can ask for it. And I will say that they didn't necessarily collect it, expecting to give it to you as the end-use consumer of their good or service. But I will say that for the I think many students interested in sustainability, and faculty and others are interested in preparing for a future and preparing students to be professionals in corporate social responsibility or in any role within a corporation that seeks to be socially responsible. And I just want to note that when you make these types of requests, you will encounter some corporate social responsibility folks who will say, this is too hard, this is not possible, this is unreasonable. And you will, on the other hand, encounter some who will say, thank you for asking. Because when you ask, I get the ear of our leadership, I get budget, I get will and cooperation across the corporation to do this type of thing. And so I just want to note that, for those of you who are students on this call and may be going into the profession and may want to be in a corporation working on social responsibility, be that person now for your future self, who knocks on the door and says, we want to know, and we want to support you in working within your organization to get these answers, because we think that there's a simple moral obligation for the organization to have these answers for us. So I'll say one last thing. In addition to those supply chain initiatives that you can tap into, there are some supplier rating systems and evaluation services, such as SEDEX, S-E-D-E-X. That's really for commodities. EcoVadis is one. There are other ones as well. We actually have, if you're interested, if you go to sustainablepurchasing.org/COSR, Committee on Supplier Ratings, there are some tools there that you can look at as well that we have some evaluations of.
Thank you, Sam, so much. And I think we have Bob back. So Bob, take it over.
Thank you, Sam. So my timing's going to be a little strange today. I will do my best to hurry up parts of my presentation. To to account for the adjustments we just need to make. I'd like to try to answer these questions, at least briefly. Why transparency? Transparency of what? Or what do we mean by the word transparency, and how does it apply to our institutions? Thirdly, can you make transparency happen on your own within your institution? Fourthly, where can universities start if they've not already begun to make their own supply chains transparent? And finally, what are students up to? So let me begin with a story from the apparel sector. You're looking at a picture of the Tazreen factory fire in 2012. 120 workers died in this building, and it revealed important lessons about transparency. When in the rubble of the fire, the insignia of U.S. military were found. And it turned out that these were Marine Corps, Army, Navy logos being sold in the military exchanges on bases in the United States and abroad. And the transparency part is that the military exchanges didn't know that their vendors were sourcing their licensed apparel in this factory. Even more interesting was that Walmart had been using this particular factory, the one that burned down, and had audited the factory, had found that it was not compliant with its safety conditions, and had kicked the factory out of Walmart's supply chain. Instead, Walmart shifted to another intermediary distributor, and it turned out that that distributor turned right around and retained the same factory to provide the licensed apparel, not disclosing so to Walmart. So the lessons from this experience are that you can't fix what you cannot see, which is the situation the U.S. military exchanges found themselves in. And even when you try to do the right thing, like Walmart did, there's no accountability down your supply chain unless it is transparent. Of course, the apparel sector is not the only one where transparency is crucial and human rights abuses are lethal. Here's a picture of the seafood sector emanating from the South China Sea, where human slavery, not modern slavery, but old-fashioned slavery has become notorious. In the electronics sector, modern slavery takes the form of migrant laborers whose travel documents are taken so that they cannot leave the campuses where they are confined to work. In the Foxconn factories, which make the very computer I'm speaking to you from today, an Apple computer, in these factories, the workers are also confined to the premises, and you're looking at the suicide nets that Foxconn put up to catch the workers. Child labor is prevalent in the seafood sector as well as the apparel sector. And in many countries, workers do not have the right to organize a union or associate freely. This particular demonstration in Pakistan is focusing on below poverty wages. And another picture of lethal working conditions in the apparel sector. So when we're defining transparency, we mean to be visible through something. We're trying to detect something that should be evident or obvious to us as consumers or as purchasers, but isn't because the supply chains are not transparent. And when we want to make our supply chains transparent, we have to understand that we're working through multiple levels, multiple companies, working in multiple countries. But what we ultimately want to see are the people, the workers who make the televisions and the computers and the uniforms and the food stocks that we depend on. As Sam was saying, the theory of change for transparency is simple. And it's not just a moral case, it's a management case. If the goal is respect for human rights, or what the ILO, the International Labor Organization, refers to as decent work, the objective is transparency that's necessary to give companies the knowledge to manage their supply chain, to give them the capacity to manage. And transparency is essential for accountability because if the supply chain isn't transparent, there's no reputation risk, and thus there's no political will or no commercial will to respect human rights. The good news is that there's a lot going on in terms of transparency. My program at Georgetown is surveying over 20 transparency initiatives that you can put into at least 5 categories, all of which are innovating in one way or another. let me just briefly give you a sense of what these categories are, and I'll have to be faster than I otherwise might. The problem is that with all this innovation occurring within 5 different categories, you're going to get anomalous results. You're going to get innovations that are going off in different directions with different terminology, and the result can be quite confusing. And so transparency innovation is part of the problem, but it's the part that we can get a grip on. So Sam talked at length about university licensed apparel and the progress made in the early 2000s by the Worker Rights Consortium. This led to a wave of procurement law reforms, including cities and states in the United States, the Transparency Act of 2006 adopted by the US Congress, and some European countries, particularly the Nordic countries, adopted transparency laws. Multi-stakeholder initiatives, for example, the Accord on Building Safety in Bangladesh, provided transparency of the actual conditions, the safety risks, and the remedies being provided to make workers safe. And more recently, so-called supply chain laws have been adopted in California, and Article 51 of the Modern Slavery Act of the United Kingdom. But these supply chain laws, ironically, don't require the supply chain to be transparent. What they do is invite companies to disclose what the company's policy requires. In other words, it's tell us what you do transparency. And finally, some benchmarks have arisen recently that try to compare companies in terms of their transparency practices. And the result is progress, but it's very complicated, and it's probably too complicated to make sense of. I mean, if it's hard for me to make sense of it as a researcher, it's going to be even more hard for you to make sense of as a procurement officer. And so our quest here at Georgetown is to try to take the Rubik's Cube of complexity and turn it into something that's two-dimensional and manageable. So we're trying to put together a two-dimensional matrix. It's complicated enough to be real, but not more than necessary, and it ends up looking like this. Transparency has 2 dimensions, and they're both intuitive. The first dimension is depth of the supply chain, and you know this from your work so far in sustainability. You start with a prime contract. Your prime contractor usually refers to a Tier 1 factory or employs a Tier 1 factory to produce the finished good, whether it's a computer monitor or a uniform. The Tier 2 factory provides the parts that are used in the Tier 1 factory, but the Tier 2 factory in turn needs to draw on a supply chain of raw materials. So that's what I mean by depth of the supply chain. The other dimension of transparency are the stages of disclosure. This is what human rights advocates call the stages of due diligence. So it begins in column 1 here with identifying who your contractor is. What is its actual corporate identification? Who's the beneficial owner? And what's the procurement volume? Stage 2 is the company's policies. Do they have a code of conduct, for example? Stage 3 is location of production, and I've highlighted stage 3 here simply because this is where most people get stuck. This is where many companies balk because they don't want to reveal their supply chain, fearing that it's going to put them at a commercial disadvantage. Stage 4 are the working conditions on the ground, often investigated through audits, but increasingly investigated through worker-centered monitoring, databases that the workers directly contribute to. And finally, there's remedies for abusive conditions. But I've broken these into 2 columns because there's a big difference in putting together a remedy plan versus actually providing a remedy on the ground. The latter requires money and a commitment of resources. Now, once you frame transparency in these 2 dimensions, you can compare the initiatives. So I mentioned governments that adopted transparency reforms, and the leaders among them include the Swedish counties, which cover 5 out of the 6 stages, versus Madison, Wisconsin, one of the better performing jurisdictions in the United States, which covers the first 3, including the location of production for its uniforms for police, fire, and other public workers. By contrast, the Accord in Bangladesh does a better job of reporting on working conditions on the ground and even remedies, but it doesn't tell you who the factories sell to. In other words, the purchaser's missing, and so the buck stops short of accountability for the purchasers that are facing the consumers ultimately. The U.S. Transparency Act is probably one of the stronger laws on the books, but it's been implemented to cover only transparency of the contractor's identification in the procurement volume. And the so-called Transparency Act in California doesn't do that even. It provides information about company policies, but not actual locations of production. So you see, this is a picture of inertia to some extent. We are making progress, there is innovation, but the ball isn't moving forward except inches at a time. And so the ball needs to be kicked. And how do you do that? As an experiment, my program at Georgetown is trying to answer the question, can you make transparency happen enough that it would provide the necessary kick to reestablish momentum forward? And as a case study, we focused on U.S. government procurement of apparel. Let me give you a snapshot of our findings to date. We've used 4 sources of data, relying primarily on U.S. government procurement data from the Transparency Act and customs data that tells us where the government contractors customarily source their goods from other countries. I say customarily because customs data does not link us to a particular government contract, and that's also a transparency gap on the procurement data. To try to fill gaps, we also looked at contractors' disclosures of their own policies, and we relied on country reports from the U.S. State Department to do some risk assessment. So here's what we found. These are the top 7 non-defense agencies which source goods from abroad. And you can see Homeland Security and Justice by far more than the others at around $82 million per year. And here's a picture of several departments. Homeland Security is the biggest. Homeland sources from 2 countries in the Caribbean, Dominican Republic and Honduras. Department of State sources from about 8 countries in Asia, all of which have a history of human rights abuses or risks thereof. The Department of Justice follows a similar pattern with sources in Asia, and the General Services Administration from both the Caribbean and Asian sources. And when you take all of this information and map it in the 2-dimensional matrix of risk factors, you see the countries listed there on the left. And the risk factors are things like below poverty wages and weak labor enforcement, which means that there's no one holding the contractors or their Tier 1 factories or their Tier 2 factories accountable for violating local laws. When you supply the data, it looks like this. The colors tell you that every country in the customary sources of government suppliers has at least 2 and usually 3 or more risk factors that are prevalent in their supply chain. Let's look for evidence of actual human rights abuses. So these are the ones I mentioned earlier: trafficking in forced labor, child labor, discrimination, frustration of the right to organize, wage theft, and unsafe conditions. And when you supply the data, you see that the pattern is quite strong. So we can take from this superficial risk assessment that U.S. government agencies buy from the same high-risk supply chains that other actors do in the commercial economy. And so when you compare U.S. agencies, for example, the Department of State, to Swedish counties, this table tells you that the Swedish counties cover 5 out of 6 stages of disclosure, and most State Department contractors cover only the very first one, which is to say it's public information who the contractor is and what the procurement volume is. Only a couple of them provide information about company policies or even have company policies. The other agencies follow the same pattern. So let me conclude by just talking briefly about where universities might start. Sam has covered some of this by comparison to the student activism in the early 2000s, which produced the Worker Rights Consortium. You can recall that universities have already started. You already have a model for transparency that worked in the apparel sector, but it's for licensed apparel, and it has not, curiously, been applied to university procurement of the same types of apparel. For example, hospital uniforms. What about that fish you're serving in the university food service? Did it come from the South China Sea? If so, it's likely to have been tainted by slaves in the production line. What about computers where forced labor and human trafficking is proven to be a problem in Asian production facilities. Here, a model has been provided by the London University's Purchasing Consortium, which has been the leader in creating Electronics Watch, a very close cousin for the Worker Rights Consortium. Like the WRC, Electronics Watch has a strong code of conduct coupled with a strong monitoring capacity. So where might you start? If we bring back the two-dimensional matrix of transparency and follow the lead of the London University's Purchasing Consortium, it's as simple as 1, 2, 3. Are you disclosing your prime contractors to your own students? Does your university have a code of conduct that applies to procurement as well as to licensing of apparel? Does it cover Tier 1 factories, including the actual location of production? This is just a part of the matrix, but it is the place to start, and most universities have not really taken on these stages. I'm optimistic that this is quite doable, that this is the kind of transparencies that, if there is will, universities actually can make this transparency happen. And once they do, it'll establish positive momentum to fill out the remaining needs for transparency in subsequent stages. So at this point, I'd like to see if Diana is up to speaking. If so, she can perhaps show the contrast between the activism of the early 2000s with her coalition's work that I notice has begun with scenario planning, theories of change, and network development. So Diana, are you able to talk to us?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I've been losing my voice, so I'm going to do my best for a couple of minutes. I apologize, but it might be for the better. I could talk about this stuff for a long time. So I'm going to keep it pretty quick, but thank you, Sam and Bob, as well. I think from a student perspective, it was kind of confusing to come in and want to care about these issues so much and to be confronted with the fact that as a student, you're often really passionate, very brilliant, very excited to work on these issues, and yet you have the dual factor of the issues seeming very large and distant, as well as just having little exposure to what the field is looking like as well. In the comparison to the anti-sweatshop movement, a couple of us students last year really decided to start working with our administration on the non-licensed codes, exactly what Bob was saying, since the license codes only takes up a portion of how much buying power each university really has in their location. So a couple of weeks before we met, we realized that we didn't have nearly the amount of information that we wanted to in order to make a compelling argument to the administration to change their policies. So instead, we walked into the administration's office and asked them to join us in a partnership. And over the past year, it's been really successful as far as having multiple meetings with procurement staff, sustainability officers, professors from across different graduate schools here on our campus, and probably close to 30 or 40 informal interviews with really diverse stakeholders in the field. So really, first, I love the partnership approach that we've been taking. That's something we've been trying to make more available to other students as well. But secondly, and maybe more on a long-term scale, we realize that so many students will have very different approaches, very different ideas, given, like Sam and Bob have been saying, it touches different sectors in every region of the world. So our perspective then started to shift to how do we best bridge the gap between the students and the professional field? How do we professionally train students so that they can go into different fields and go into different sectors and be very prepared to take lead initiative regardless of how they decide to approach these issues? So really, we decided to test this out this past year and have an intercollegiate convention where the workshops themselves were more focused on professional skill development rather than just topical discussions. You'll see, here's a picture. It was a great turnout. And really what was inspiring, I think, to a lot of us was, first, that nothing could replace the importance of having relationships and gathering people. But also, secondly, realizing that everyone's looking to get better understanding of these issues. And with the small effort that we were able to accomplish in just a year as a pilot project. We realized that there is definitely a need to bridge the gap between students and the professional field. So students are a great resource. They are excited and they are eager to get great exposure. But as students, I think a lot of times students have a hard time seeing potential opportunities to contribute. So our focus will be to continue to have regional events, but also to start to take the networks that we're building and make an online tool that's able to help show what not only is going on in the field, but what I should say is not to necessarily try to map the supply chains, for example, but what we're going to continue to actually map out are the stakeholders, the contributors, so that everyone can have a better taste of what's actually going on across the board rather than just who's in their network. So it's basically a crowdsourcing mentality. If different students are building out their networks and we're able to continue to have different people touch different solutions and innovations, how do you pull all of that resource, all those resources and information together onto a central platform that can really give anyone who's in this space a better understanding of all of the people? That way you can amplify your efforts, you can make sure you're not duplicating things, you can try to find better ways that people are approaching a similar initiative, you can find opportunities for partnership, or really just be able to spread the word about innovative insights. Like Sam brought up with blockchain technology, that's something that's been coming up a lot. So how do you get these really cutting edge innovations and models and amplify the effects that they have? And what better place? The universities. Universities are based on a platform of educating generations and really objectively trying to find new improvements to the ways that we interact with our world. So we've just been starting to really dig out. I guess we're just scratching the surface, really, and our group has been focusing on how to create a platform that can really harness the network if we really want to scale up. So I think that might be to the extent that my voice will let me talk about this right now, but really we just welcome everyone to have a conversation with us, because we are building out kind of a platform that will be able to map people like you all who are on this call, like people who are doing sustainability efforts who are probably actually also really related to this, but it might not have a human rights label. So we're really excited. We know that a lot of the long-term gains will come from the students who are turning through our education systems currently. And we really want to harness that and make sure that you all get the opportunity to harness that as well. So I'm here to ask questions, and also I'm happy to follow up and explain more given the limitation of my voice. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Sam, Bob, and Diana, for providing your expertise today. And we will now turn to our audience for questions. I'd like to remind everyone to submit your questions. You just type them into the questions pane on the GoToWebinar control panel. So I'll go to Bob first with this question. How would one review worker-centered monitoring? Is there a forum or a network that is known?
The Worker Rights Consortium takes this approach. In the simplest terms, it means when you do audits, you don't interview workers right in front of their floor line supervisors. And that, frankly, is one of the most common critiques of conventional social auditing. Talk to workers in a place where they can be candid, where they don't have to fear being fired just because they're talking to an investigator. In a more sophisticated way, there are actually for-profit companies out there creating systems that protect the anonymity of workers so that workers can provide data in real time, like during the night on the factory floor, as to the temperature, the air condition, whether they're able to breathe, whether the fire escapes are actually open and available to them, information of that kind. So worker-centered monitoring is very graphic and on one level very simple, but can also benefit from use of technology to protect the worker's identity and to amass data on a very large scale.
Thank you, Bob. I'll go to Sam for the next question. Can you provide the list of supplier evaluation systems that you mentioned in your presentation? Sam?
Sure, sorry. Yep, if you go to sustainablepurchasing.org/COSR, that's like, it stands for Committee on Supplier Ratings. There's a list there of several supplier rating agencies, and that's a tool that is not necessarily a tool for supply chain transparency. It's more a tool for evaluating your suppliers if you wanted to evaluate many of your suppliers at once in a consistent way, including things like what their due diligence capabilities are to some extent. One of those tools might be useful to you. It's a part of it. Many organizations are trying to figure out how to query information from their suppliers without creating whole new systems for them to be responding to all the time, similar but different questionnaires and so on. And so those tools are really a solution to that problem. So it's a part of disclosure, but not necessarily full supply chain disclosure like we're talking about now.
Thank you, Sam. I'll go to Diana next. A student would like to start a chapter of ICAMS on their campus. How do they get started?
Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that too. So you'll see my email, but this is such a great time if you email me, we'll get in contact with you as well. Sam and Bob both know that we've been actually rebranding and restructuring as well for the past few weeks, so that's why there hasn't been as much public material out there. But if you get in touch, the model that we're hoping to build out is to continue to have annual regional events for students, like the one that we had this past April in Boston. So as a preview for the spring, hopefully in March, April, we'll be looking at hopefully expanding it 3 regions, but we're happy to do more if excited students are willing to take it on. We'll be looking in San Diego, New York, and DC, all cities we think are definitely eager to be working on these issues as well. Otherwise, too, we'll also be putting out a lot more materials online for students and trying to build stronger communication methods. But the website that we are building right now that should be done will actually hopefully be a good central platform so that if any student wants to get involved, they can go there. It's like their one-stop shop that should be able to point them to our own work, like you asked, but also to highlight what other schools are doing. That's really great as well. So definitely follow up with me as well, and we'll keep continuing to be able to spread the word. But we believe that similar to the anti-SPLC movement, once you get enough schools, kind of the first couple of schools buying into it, that a lot more schools will be able to invest as well. And that's what we're hoping for, not only for our work, really the procurement work in general. Once you pressure enough universities based on their students who are really passionate about it, universities will start to really pay attention to it. And Sam said something great last week. He said, really universities and procurement staff need to recognize that this is inevitable, that it's no longer just a nice thing that universities could do, but it's inevitable and it's definitely possible. And we believe that the best parallel to the anti-SPLC movement is really that it'll be student-driven, and that's what will help really drive the interest and the pressure for universities to take this on as their own as well. So thank you for your interest. Definitely follow up, and we'll definitely get you started as soon as possible.
Thank you, Diana. The next question is for Sam and Bob. Sam, why don't you go first? I'm super interested in working in this space, but have no idea how to break in or get involved. Do you have advice?
Well, it would be good to know what that person's role is. Is this a student, researcher, procurement professional? I'm going to MBA student in sustainability.
In sustainability.
Boy, as an MBA student in sustainability, you could definitely use some of your class assignments to look at all types of things related to transparency, the capabilities that companies and technology that companies are using around supply chain transparency, the business case for supply chain transparency, interface between supply chain transparency or data and consumers and end-use customers, institutional end-use customers. And by educating yourself about those things, you will prepare yourself to be very interesting and very useful to a lot of large companies and organizations that are struggling right now to figure out how to respond to this convergence of demand and technologies and wherewithal. Bob, over to you.
We need more information about buyers and sellers. So on the buyer end, what are universities purchasing? Obviously, we know the types of things, but what's the scale of purchasing? How many computers do universities buy themselves as opposed to computers that universities facilitate purchase in terms of students or faculty? How do they buy those computers? Do they do it through distributors? Do they do it through contracts that service students through the bookstore? Do they do it with a discount program? In other words, the metes and bounds of the market in terms of the purchaser side. In terms of sellers to the market, what's the size of the market overall? How much market leverage do universities have as a whole or as a group? This information would be useful not only for purposes of figuring out the scale of leverage an individual institution has, but if universities were to band together in a purchasing consortium, as some do, how much success could they expect in terms of reducing the price per unit? And how much leverage could they wield in terms of asking their distributors and the brand name manufacturers to be more transparent down their supply chains? The London Purchasing Consortium is a fascinating model, and I don't know of anyone who studied how it would be compared to something going on in the United States. So to what extent have universities sought to aggregate their purchasing power? Probably many people on this call could tell us right now, have they applied it in the context of transparency related to human rights? That's just a taste of the issues.
And that's actually great advice for any students to use your opportunity as a customer and as a special person on your college campus to step in to the conversations that are happening in the business offices and ask questions. One thing that always surprised me was that as students, students always wanted to go talk to the president. But I found that if you walked into the business office and you walked into the back offices of many of the departments around campus and you said to them, you know what, I'm really interested in what you do and understanding it and how it might be useful to things like sustainability, people were always thrilled to talk to me and engage me in their work. And because everyone who works at a university takes pride in being part of the educational mission, but few of them or many of them don't get the opportunity to have students come and be mentored by them. So I would also, offer you the opportunity to engage, as Bob was suggesting, in really engaging with the data at your organization and the people at your organization in that way.
Thank you so much. We're at the end of our questions, so I'll invite you to briefly share your final comments with our audience before we conclude today's webinar. Sam, would you like to go first?
Well, I just would conclude actually with something that Diana reminded me of, actually, which I appreciate, that I really do feel that this convergence is inevitable. It is inevitable that we will have the type of radical transparency that I showed earlier with that T-shirt manufacturer. And the question is, how are we going to make sure that transparency is impactful? And that's the type of thing that Bob can help us with. And I hope that everyone on this call will join us in both of those quests.
Diana?
Yeah, definitely, Sam. I would just end by saying I think one of the best things that has consistently benefited me, at least, is to continually listen to other people. As a student, I've been really lucky to have the chance to explore these questions in a context that's separate from an organization in the sense that, like, I was able to go to the AASHE conference this past October and really hear different approaches to sustainability that have benefited the way that I thought about this that don't have these labels on it as well. And I think that's really important when you start to think about what Bob has been saying and just the way that you are going to be interacting with so many different groups. Even if you just try to look at one supply chain, it just starts to rapidly expand. So I think the framework that you use to approach this needs to be transferable to other groups. Going back to the MBA student who asked the question, how do you think about communicating this to the private sector when human rights advocates generally speak one language and business people speak another as well? So the last thing I'll leave off with is just a quick anecdote. When we first started to present the work that we were doing at universities back in March, we gave a presentation at another sustainability conference, and afterwards someone asked me, "Are you working with your business school?" And I said, well, we work with some of the professors on the procurement policies of our school. And he said, that's great, but if you're not changing the school of thought that's happening across the river, it'll always be an upstream battle. So I would just advocate the, just taking the time and opportunity to try to think in a more framework mentality of how do you really try to weave this out in every aspect, and how do you understand the audience as well enough to be able to welcome them into this change and not make them feel like this is going to be a threat to them as well.
Bob, would you like to conclude?
Thank you. So since students organized in the early 2000s and created a meaningful step forward on transparency, the Worker Rights Consortium, there's been a lot of experimentation. There have been over 20 different initiatives. And while that reflects progress and a lot of learning, it's also been confusing. A lot of the language is jargon and inconsistent and points in various directions. So the question I like to try to answer is, how can we, as researchers and as purchasers, make transparency happen? As a researcher, I think we've come a long way in terms of simplifying the elements of transparency so that we can speak a common language. Now the question becomes, can we apply that to our own institutions, test it, and then move on to a larger scale? So within our own institutions, how can we make transparency happen? Like Sam suggested, simply by asking, what are we buying, who are we buying it from, and where do they source their goods? If we can learn only what we're buying and who do we buy it from, that's enough information to start doing research on our own as faculty and as students, and we can fill in a good deal of the puzzle, as you saw in my presentation earlier today. We developed that information about the U.S. government without direct help from the U.S. government. We relied on public data sources. Finally, on a broader scale, are there models for doing this efficiently and having enough leverage on the marketplace to actually make change that will be felt by the workers down those supply chains, the people who are producing the goods on the factory floor that make life so enjoyable and productive for the rest of us? And the answers are all around us. We've seen that the London University's Purchasing Consortium has leveraged its purchasing power not only to reduce the prices on the goods they pay for, but also to radically increase the transparency in the electronic sector, and hopefully soon to come the apparel sector and the food sector. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk with you all today.
Thank you so much, Bob, Sam, and Diana. Before we conclude, I wanted to let everyone know about, well, if I can actually switch, about our next webinar. Unfortunately, the webinar we had scheduled for this Wednesday has been canceled. So our next webinar will take place on November 29. We'll have Kathleen O'Brien, the author of Emerge, a strategic leadership model for the sustainable building community, join us to describe the model and in particular how the mindset of others and ourselves are critical in achieving a truly sustainable future. You can learn more about this webinar and our other offerings on our website. Thank you so much again to our panelists and our attendees, and we hope to see you again on a future webinar or AASHE event. If you have additional questions after the webinar, please email them to us. And a reminder that the recording and presentation materials will be available in the AASHE Campus Sustainability Hub, likely tomorrow, and you'll receive a notification once they're uploaded. Have a good day, everyone.